Hello and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're zeroing in on the UK's response to those recent US steel tariffs. If you're trying to get a handle on what this whole developing story means for trade across the Atlantic, well, you've definitely come to the right place. Our analysis today draws on reporting from Westferry Times. Thank you for watching Westferry Times.
It's good to be here.
And helping us navigate this pretty complex terrain is Professor David Linwood. He's a leading expert in international trade and a senior fellow at the Royal Institute for Global Affairs. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to contribute.
So our goal today, it's pretty clear. We want to unpack the specifics of these U.S. tariffs, really understand the UK's reaction, both government and, industry level. We'll explore the broader implications for global trade and maybe get a sense of what might happen next. So, Professor, let's just dive right in. Could you maybe break down for us exactly what these U.S. tariffs involve?
Certainly. So what we're seeing is the United States imposing a 25% tariff on imported steel and a 10% tariff on imported aluminum. Now, this is being done under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act.
Section 232.
Yes, it's a piece of U.S. law that lets the president put tariffs on imports if they're seen as a threat to national security.
Yeah.
It's probably worth remembering, we saw similar moves back during the Trump administration. It's not entirely new ground.
Right.
This specific action targets certain categories of steel and aluminum coming from the UK and also the European Union. It's, using a law usually meant for things like, say, weapons production, but applying it now to trade, which has, definitely stirred up some debate among trade folks.
Okay, and the timing. Why now? What's the thinking behind introducing these tariffs at this particular moment?
Well, there are likely a few factors converging here. Economically, the Biden administration is probably feeling some pressure from domestic steel and aluminum producers, especially in those key industrial states like Pennsylvania and Ohio.
The political angle.
Exactly. With the 2024 election cycle getting closer, those regions become, even more politically important. And beyond just domestic economics, there's definitely a political dimension, too. You could see these tariffs as a way for the U.S. to assert a bit of leverage in wider global trade talks. There's particular focus on China's massive steel overproduction and a U.S. concern that this surplus steel is kind of finding its way into the American market indirectly, maybe via countries like the UK.
Right, the sort of dumping issue we hear about.
Precisely. Exporting goods below their normal value, which can really hurt domestic producers in the importing country. That's a key concern driving this.
Okay, that helps frame it.
Yeah.
So let's unpack the UK side then. How has the UK government actually responded to these tariffs landing?
Well, the official line from London has been quite firm. They've expressed deep regret over the U.S. decision. Their immediate priority seems to be getting an exemption for the UK.
How are they trying to do that?
They're actively in bilateral talks, negotiations with their U.S. counterparts.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're also apparently considering lodging a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization, the WTO, as another potential route to challenge them.
Okay. And what about the UK steelmakers themselves? What's the feeling on the ground, so to speak?
Understandably, there's quite a bit of concern, significant concern, actually, among UK steel producers, particularly those based in the traditional steelmaking areas like South Yorkshire and South Wales. A lot of these companies really rely on access to the U.S. market, especially for their specialized high-grade steel products, the kind used in aerospace, for instance, or complex construction projects. Certain alloys made in Sheffield are crucial for things like aircraft engines.
So these tariffs could really hit them hard.
They pose a direct threat, a threat to their export volumes, and that naturally raises serious worries about potential job losses in those communities. And the trade unions, like Unite, they've been very vocal, urging the government to be ready with retaliatory measures if these talks don't work out.
Retaliation, that sounds like a pretty serious step up. Is the UK really thinking about hitting back with its own tariffs on U.S. goods?
It's definitely one of the tools they have. The government is certainly looking at various options. If the negotiations don't lead to an exemption, well, they could think about imposing what are sometimes called mirror tariffs.
Mirror tariffs.
Yeah, tariffs on specific U.S. goods, often chosen quite strategically to create political heat in key U.S. states. Things like Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Kentucky bourbon whiskey, maybe agricultural machinery made in certain politically sensitive areas have been mentioned as possibilities.
Right, targeting things that will get noticed politically in the U.S.
Exactly. But look, the UK government is kind of walking a tightrope here. They're keen to project this post-Brexit image as, a champion of free trade. So they'll likely push hard for a negotiated settlement if they could possibly get one.
That makes sense. So let's zoom out just a little. How does the UK's whole post-Brexit status influence its ability to handle this specific dispute?
That's a really critical part of the picture. Before Brexit, remember, the UK was part of the EU, so it benefited from the collective bargaining power of that huge economic bloc that naturally gave it more weight in trade disputes.
Right, strength in numbers.
Precisely. Now, operating on its own, the UK has, yes, more flexibility in its trade policy, but it's also arguably more vulnerable when dealing with giants like the US. The US knows the UK market is much smaller than the whole EU bloc was, so you could say the US holds a slightly stronger negotiating hand here.
So that vulnerability you mentioned, it means it's harder to push back alone.
Potentially, yes. The UK has to negotiate these exemptions and any potential retaliation all by itself without that broader EU support and leverage it used to have.
And what about those long talked about plans for a UK-US free trade agreement? Does this tariff argument throw a bit of a spanner in the works for that?
Oh, it certainly doesn't help things along. Progress on a big UK-US trade deal was already, shall we say, moving at a pretty deliberate pace.
Slow, you mean?
Well, yes, this new disagreement over steel just adds another significant hurdle. And there's an asymmetry, too. While the amount of steel the U.S. buys from the U.K. might be relatively small for the U.S. overall, those same exports are much more significant for the U.K., both economically and, symbolically, representing its industrial capacity. That naturally complicates the talks.
Okay, let's switch focus slightly to the internal pressures. What's happening domestically on both sides of the Atlantic that's shaping how the governments are reacting?
Well, here in the UK, the government is definitely under pressure to show that its global Britain idea can actually protect domestic industries when these kinds of challenges pop up. The labor opposition has been quite loud, calling for more strategic government support for steel and urging a tougher stance against what they term U.S. aggression.
And in the U.S., what are the pressures on President Biden?
Across the pond, President Biden's also dealing with domestic forces. He needs to keep unionized workers on side, many of whom are in those manufacturing states we mentioned, like Pennsylvania and Ohio.
Right, the electoral map again.
Absolutely. There's a big political need to be seen as defending American jobs, even if the actual economic impact of these specific tariffs on the Rust Belt might be, limited or debatable. In politics, the optics, the perception of protecting industry, can be just as important as the raw economic data.
That's a good point. And what about the rest of the world? How are other countries reacting or interpreting this?
Oh, the European Union is watching this very, very closely. If the UK manages to get some kind of exemption, you can bet Brussels will be knocking on Washington's door asking for similar treatment.
Makes sense.
And other big steel exporters, like Japan and South Korea, they'll also be looking at this and likely reassessing their own export strategies towards the U.S. Interestingly, this kind of friction between Western allies could maybe inadvertently benefit countries like China. It could potentially create divisions. More broadly, though, this whole episode kind of highlights a growing global worry about the fragility of supply chains after the pandemic and this noticeable drift back towards protectionism in some economies.
So, Professor, looking ahead then, what do you see as the most likely path forward? Are we heading for a sort of full-blown trade war, or is de-escalation more probable?
My feeling leans towards what you might call managed de-escalation.
Managed de-escalation.
Yeah, I think both the UK and the US understand that a full-scale trade fight would have pretty serious negative effects for both economies. Nobody really wants that. So I suspect we might see some kind of temporary exemptions being worked out, maybe linked to specific promises from the UK side about, say, better import transparency or stricter rules against dumping.
Okay, so finding a sort of middle ground, perhaps.
Exactly, a pragmatic solution. There's also, I think, a strong chance we'll see a more comprehensive bilateral deal announced just on steel and aluminum trade between the U.S. and U.K., maybe something similar in structure to the agreement the U.S. reached with the EU back in 2022.
Right, a specific framework just for these metals.
Precisely.
And for businesses caught up in all this, what's the key advice right now?
Well, businesses really need to brace themselves for ongoing volatility in international trade. It's just the reality now. The key strategies. I'd say diversification is crucial. Look for alternative export markets if you can. Also, diversify your supply chains. Try not to rely too heavily on single sources. And maybe most importantly, stay extremely well informed. These trade policies can change really, really quickly.
That's sound advice. Professor Linwood, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today on this deep dive. Your insights have been incredibly helpful.
It was my pleasure entirely.
So that brings us towards the end of our deep dive into the UK's response to the US steel tariffs. While the future of global trade definitely seems a bit uncertain right now, rest assured we'll keep monitoring these developments closely and bring you the analysis you need. And maybe just a final thought for you to consider. In this increasingly interconnected world we live in, what really is the justifiable balance between uh, legitimate national security concerns on one hand and the principles of free trade on the other? What might be the long-term consequences of these kinds of protectionist moves, not just for global economic stability, but also for those intricate diplomatic ties between nations? Something to mull over. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.